Constantin Alajálov was born in 1900 in the city of Rostov-na-Donu in the southwest of Russia. At the age of 16 he enrolled at the university in what was at that time Petrograd, but is now St. Petersburg, over 1,000 miles distant from his home. Only a year later the 1917 revolution erupted, immediately putting an end to his formal art education. Instead, he was put to work with others to produce political propaganda as murals and posters to be displayed throughout the region. In 1920 he fled Russia, and following stays in Persia and Turkey, he used the last of his money to get him on a ship bound for New York in 1923. For some time after his arrival he struggled to find work, but did manage to keep himself fed with some commissions to paint murals for restaurants, hotels and nightclubs. But unfortunately I failed to find a single example to show in support of this. In 1926 he was given the opportunity to design the cover for a modern art exhibition, but far more significantly he was also commissioned in that year to create a cover for the New Yorker. The magazine had itself only been in existence for a year, but was already gaining considerable popularity with the public. The reaction from the magazine's art editor, Ray Irvin, himself a staunch modernist, was particularly favourable, and several more commissions for cover illustrations followed into 1927, all of which revealed Alajálov, at this point spelling his surname with a D before the J, to be an accomplished and stylish image maker, strongly influenced by the disciplines of Cubism and Futurism, and somewhat ironically, given Alajálov's lack of enthusiasm for the Russian Revolution, the constructivism of Vladimir Lebedev. But he added a light-hearted, frivolous imagination to the content of his images, not generally on display in these artistic movements. As such, his images chime perfectly with the ethos of the Jazz Age and the New Yorker's own determination to break with traditional representational illustration. The considerable platform he had found with the New Yorker soon led to other clients keen to commission him in the later years of the decade, and in addition to this stylish book jacket design, he also created this apparently isolated cover for the Chicagoan, a magazine cast very much in the same image as the New Yorker. In the same year he also created a cover illustration for the prestigious Vanity Fair and would go on to produce several more, although not as anything like the volume he was creating for the New Yorker, which was undoubtedly his most frequent client at the time. And in his work for the New Yorker there were already noticeable signs that he was evolving, and his early bold geometric styling was starting to give way to a more organic, tonally painted approach, even if it was still nobody's idea of representational. But he did continue to harness angularity in his compositions and figure work. Whatever his stylistic approach, his favoured medium was gouache paint or occasionally tempera, which he applied both flat and increasingly in tonal application, and even combined both within the same image. But even as this evolution was evident on the covers he was creating, there continued to be other examples of his work, such as this bold graphic poster created to promote a Marx Brothers movie in 1931, and Alajálov's debut on the cover of the recently established business magazine Fortune, which persisted with flatter graphic styling. In 1932 he was chosen by the composer George Gershwin, a fellow Russian émigré, to illustrate his songbook, a collection of lyrics from 18 of his best-known compositions. And Alajálov visualised them all humorously and on occasion somewhat obtusely, with visual references not necessarily found in the actual lyrics. Typical of the times in the USA, there was a certain amount of racial stereotyping evident in some of the images, but given the similarly distorted portrayals of white people and even some Inuits, I'd say it was fairly even-handed treatment in all his characters. Gershwin's popular success as a composer and lyricist in the 1930s would in itself have made the book popular enough. But the addition of Alajálov's limited palette, angular and disjointed compositions added considerably to the book's fashionable appeal, and at the time it was a bestseller and greatly enhanced his public profile and reputation. Following this success, Alajálov returned to more frequent appearances on the cover of the New Yorker and set about satirising the lifestyles and social mores of its broadly affluent and almost exclusively white readership. They were uniformly visually eloquent, and his dry humour had no need of words to make its witty point with absolute clarity. And other than this apparently final cover for Vanity Fair, the New Yorker remained arguably his best and certainly most frequent platform. In the 1930s he also taught part-time at a couple of New York art schools, but Alajálov was plainly a man who was determined to live his life to the full, and despite the considerable volume of illustration he was creating and his teaching roles, he still found time to travel widely, and by the later 30s was frequently spending his summers on the French Riviera. Nevertheless, he somehow continued to fit illustration work around his enviably hedonistic social life, and in 1937 he returned to the Marx Brothers with a by now rare graphically formal poster for Horse Feathers, their latest film. A year later he illustrated the humorous book Dithers and Jitters by Cornelia Otis Skinner, with a collection of line-only witty spot illustrations. The pair exhibited considerable symbiosis, and they would collaborate on more similarly humorous books in years to come. But despite all his other commitments, the New Yorker continued to be a lucrative outlet for his creativity and gentle satire. And in 1939 he created this breathtaking double-page composition for an edition of Fortune, which accompanied a journalistic overview of the turbulent 1930s under Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency in the USA. By this point, virtually all trace of his earlier flat angular styling had completely evaporated in favour of a conspicuously looser gestural approach to both line and the application of colour. And in 1941 there were yet more illustrations commissioned by the New Yorker, and other extracurricular projects such as this light-hearted image to promote the film Blithe Spirit. But things took a far more serious turn in that year when the USA joined the Allies in the Second World War following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And in that year Alajálov turned his hand and creative imagination away from frivolity with a series of impressive and visually compelling monochrome composite images published in Fortune, each one addressing specific aspects of the conflict and its impact on the country. To date his work had been entirely frivolous in nature, and not even hinted at the more sombre and impassioned side of his character, as it was revealed in this dark, disillusioned but unforgettable collection. But you can't keep a good humorist down, and even though at war, life in the USA went on pretty much as usual for many, particularly the better off. And in the same year he created more energetic, simple line drawings to illuminate Soap Behind the Ears, another light-hearted social satire from Cornelia Otis Skinner. In addition to his covers for the New Yorker, Alajálov's work had also appeared as line-only cartoons in its pages, although I found usable examples hard to come by. But I did find this collection from the war years, which, like his work for books, used a gestural brush line of considerable fluidity and expressiveness. The large volume of covers he produced for the magazine during the war, while obviously being far more considered and rendered in colour, was similarly determined to put a brave face on things and provide some light relief from the news media's relentless reportage of the victories and defeats. And in some cases they avoided the war altogether, such as this articulate comic reflection on marriage and childbirth, which also allows for closer inspection to reveal with some clarity his fondness for drag dry brush effects. In 1942 he illustrated the book Our Hearts Were Young and Gay, jointly written by Cornelia Otis Skinner and Emily Kimbrough. And this flight of fancy aimed at the female reader inspired some particularly jolly monochromes from Alajálov. In the following year he produced another collection of narrative images with a particularly light and energetic gestural touch for a verse retelling of the story by Cinderella by Alice Dewar Miller. Unlike most of his other monochrome bookwork, they were highly detailed renders and fuller compositions which combined brush and pen line work with shading created using some form of graphite, giving a grainier than usual but highly appealing look to the work. As the war drew to an end and the Allies emerged victorious, Alajálov's New Yorker covers continued to mix images which, however humorously, connected with the conflict and others which stuck with social activity. In 1945 he produced another set of gestural brush line drawings for another humorous book, Outside Eden, by Isabel Scott Rorick. And the particularly animated drawings he produced showed clearly that however appealing his colour renders were, his drawings had no need of it to succeed in their mission. It was also in 1945 that his first cover illustration for the mighty Saturday Evening Post was published. And as with his work for the New Yorker, all were tonally painted, and expressively so, in gouache. And although line work wasn't absent, it was now rather hidden beneath the painted surface. It says a lot about the high opinion both magazines shared for his work that neither even attempted to prevent him from working for the other, despite the supposed exclusivity of their contracts. And just like the New Yorker, his images for the Post reflected satirically on the nature and lifestyles of the readers of this enduringly popular mainstream publication. So now he was working regularly for both, and still found time to create a couple of posters for Pan American Airlines, and to illustrate the book Family Album by Paul Chavchavadze, with yet another collection of highly expressive monochromes. As the 1940s turned to the 50s, his popularity with the Saturday Evening Post continued undiminished, and although in stylistic terms the two had very little in common, Alajálov's amusing observations and gentle satires of American daily life bore a strong resemblance to the work of Norman Rockwell, known as the greatest visual asset the magazine ever had. Throughout his career, Alajálov had shown very little interest in creating work for advertising, but around the turn of the decade he did allow himself to be persuaded to produce a handful of press ads for various prestigious clients. But throughout the 1950s he continued to be a ubiquitous presence in both the New Yorker and the Post, and in both cases his apparently relentless imagination and satirical social humour defined every cover he created and made his point with absolute clarity as before. There were other projects too, including a 1956 book cover design for The Island Players by Ilka Chase, and another series of typical amusing line illustrations showing again how less could very much be more, dotted around the book The Ape in Me, another by Cornelia Otis Skinner in 1959. As the 1950s drew to a close, Alajálov continued to be a popular choice for the covers of the Saturday Evening Post, but in 1960 he produced his last ever cover for the New Yorker, the conclusion of a remarkable, mutually beneficial 34-year professional relationship. And just 2 years later, his equally successful 17-year-long association with the Saturday Evening Post ended in 1962. Following this, I found absolutely no more evidence of illustration work, although he continued to work as an artist, with some surprisingly pedestrian portraits and still life paintings. And Constantin Alajálov died in New York at the age of 86 in 1987. Like quite a few other Eastern European and Russian illustrators I've featured, and yet more who have yet to make an appearance, Constantin Alajálov was an accomplished, imaginative, and above all distinctive illustrator. From his early pursuit of an unlikely collision of geometric styling and humorous image making, through to his more painterly but nevertheless far from representational later work, he used his graphic skills and wit to create a large volume of good-natured imagery, which now serves as an effective visual documentation of his adopted home in the first half of the 20th century. I hope I've made a few converts of at least a few more viewers with this video tribute, and to celebrate Alajálov's life and work, here's a few more of his always fascinating good-natured illustrations extracted from the covers of both the New Yorker and the Saturday Evening Post that I couldn't manage to squeeze into the narrative.